The train from Coimbra to Lisboa carried Peter through the heart of Portugal, following the Tagus River as it widened toward the Atlantic. After the emotional intensity of discovering his grandfather's letter and making his decision about the inheritance, Peter had chosen to travel alone to Lisbon, wanting time to process everything that had happened before the crucial council meeting scheduled for the following week. João had understood Peter's need for solitude and had returned to Porto to begin preparations for the formal ceremony where Peter would officially accept his role as leader of the Portuguese operations. But before that ceremony, Peter wanted to explore Lisbon on his own terms, to experience the capital city where so much of Portugal's history and culture converged. As the train pulled into Santa Apollonia station, Peter felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Lisbon was larger and more cosmopolitan than Porto or Coimbra, a true European capital that had been shaped by centuries of maritime exploration, devastating earthquakes, and constant reinvention. It was also, according to the documents he had studied, the city where his family's network maintained its most important Portuguese offices and archives. The afternoon sun was brilliant as Peter emerged from the station and caught his first glimpse of the Tagus River, impossibly wide and dotted with ships that ranged from traditional ferries to modern cruise vessels. The famous red suspension bridge, the 25 de Abril Bridge, stretched across the water in the distance, looking remarkably similar to San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge and reminding Peter of how far he had traveled from his American life. Peter had booked a small hotel in the Alfama district, Lisbon's oldest neighborhood that had survived the great earthquake of 1755. The narrow medieval streets climbed steeply up the hillside below São Jorge Castle, creating a labyrinth of alleys, stairways, and hidden squares that felt more like a village than part of a major city. As he walked through Alfama toward his hotel, Peter was struck by how alive Lisbon felt compared to the cities he had visited in Spain. Laundry hung from balconies, neighbors called to each other from windows, and the sound of fado music drifted from open doorways. The famous yellow trams climbed impossibly steep streets with a cheerful clanging that seemed to define the city's rhythm. After checking into his hotel, Peter spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring Lisbon like a tourist rather than someone on a mission. He rode tram 28 through the historic neighborhoods, walked through the elegant Praça do Comércio with its grand archway opening onto the river, and climbed to multiple miradouros, the scenic viewpoints that offered spectacular vistas of the city's hills, red roofs, and sparkling water. At the Miradouro de Santa Luzia, Peter stood looking out over the Alfama rooftops toward the river and thought about how different this journey had become from what he had imagined when leaving Chicago. He had expected to find simple answers about his family's past, perhaps discover some interesting historical connections, and then return to figure out his life's next chapter. Instead, he had inherited responsibility for a 500-year-old international network, discovered that his quiet grandfather had been a major figure in humanitarian operations, and committed himself to reforming an organization that operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal activity. As evening approached, Peter made his way to the Bairro Alto, Lisbon's bohemian neighborhood known for its nightlife, fado houses, and traditional cafes. His grandfather's letter from Coimbra had contained a subtle reference that Peter had puzzled over. When you reach Lisbon, remember that the best Brazilian coffee is served where poets once gathered, and that some tables hold more than meets the eye. After asking several locals and consulting his phone's map, Peter identified the likely location his grandfather had referenced. A Brasileira do Chiado, one of Lisbon's most famous historic cafes, located on Rua Garrett in the elegant Chiado district. The cafe's exterior was distinctive, with Art Nouveau details and a bronze statue of the famous Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa sitting at one of the outdoor tables. Inside, the cafe retained its early 20th century character, with mirrors, marble tables, and an atmosphere that suggested countless literary and political conversations had unfolded within its walls. Peter ordered a Bica Portuguese espresso and found a seat at one of the marble tables near the back of the cafe, away from the tourist crowds gathered around Pessoa's statue outside. As he sipped his coffee and observed the mix of locals and visitors, he noticed an elderly man behind the counter watching him with interest. After a few minutes, the man approached Peter's table. "Excuse me, but you have the look of someone searching for something specific. Can I help you find it?" Peter decided to take a chance. I'm looking for a table that my family used to frequent. The family name was Mateus. The elderly man's face lit up with recognition. Ah, Mateus. Yes, of course. Your family has history with this cafe going back many decades. Please, come with me. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Senor Antonio, led Peter to a corner table near one of the large windows that looked out onto Rua Garrett. The table was similar to the others in the cafe: marble top, ornate metal base, but its location offered both privacy and a good view of the entrance. This was your family's table, Antonio explained. For as long as I can remember, and I have been working in this cafe for over 50 years, members of the Mateus family would come here when they visited Lisbon. Always this table. Always the same order: bica and a pastel de nata. Peter ran his hand over the smooth marble surface. Did my grandfather come here? Oh yes, many times. The last visit was perhaps 10 or 12 years ago. He sat at this table for hours, writing letters and meeting with various people. Very important people, I always thought, though he never made a show of it. Do you remember anything else about his visits? Antonio thought carefully before responding. I remember that he always examined this table very carefully when he arrived, as if checking that something was still in place. And I remember that he told me once that someday his grandson might come looking for the table, and that I should make sure that grandson sat in the right spot. The old man gestured to the specific chair where Peter was now sitting. This chair, facing the window and the entrance. He said it was important. After Antonio returned to his duties behind the counter, Peter began examining the table more carefully. The marble top was solid and heavy, but the metal base had several decorative elements that could potentially hide something. He ran his fingers along the underside of the table, feeling for anything unusual. First, he found nothing, but as he shifted position slightly, his fingers encountered what felt like a small metal box attached to the underside of the marble top with some kind of adhesive. Working carefully to avoid attracting attention from other cafe patrons, Peter managed to detach the box and bring it into his lap. The small metal container was about the size of a pack of cards, weathered but still intact. A small combination lock secured it, using the same 4-digit system that Peter had encountered at the monastery in Zaragoza. He tried 1487, the founding year of the network. The lock didn't open. He tried 1924, his grandfather's birth year. Nothing. Then he tried the date his grandfather had written the Coimbra letter according to the notation at the top. 2009. The lock clicked open. What do you think Peter's grandfather hid under this cafe table for over a decade? Could it be the final piece of guidance Peter needs before taking on leadership? Share your predictions in the comments. Inside the small metal box, Peter found a folded letter written on the same stationery his grandfather had used for the Coimbra message, along with a small key and what appeared to be a photograph. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, standing in front of what looked like the entrance to a university or library. She had dark hair and an intelligent, serious expression. On the back of the photo, his grandfather had written, Mariana Costa, Portuguese Operations Coordinator, age 26, trustworthy, brilliant, essential to your success. She will reveal herself when the time is right. Peter stared at the photograph, his pulse quickening. Could this be the woman from the Madrid airport? The age would be about right if the photo had been taken 10 or 12 years ago, though it was hard to be certain from the single airport glimpse he had gotten. The letter was shorter than the Coimbra message, but no less significant. Peter, if you found this letter, then you've made it to Lisbon and you're close to accepting your inheritance. But there's one more thing you need to know before the council meeting. The Portuguese operations have been coordinated by a remarkable young woman named Mariana Costa for the past several years. She comes from a family that has worked with our network for generations, and she has proven herself to be both capable and committed to our humanitarian mission. When I recruited Mariana, I told her about you. I showed her photographs and described your personality, your talents, and your potential. I asked her to keep watch over your journey through Europe if and when you decided to explore your heritage. Mariana has been observing your progress from a distance, making sure that you were safe and that the various people you encountered were genuine rather than threats. The woman you saw briefly in Madrid was Mariana confirming your arrival and beginning her protective surveillance. She will reveal herself to you properly when you've fully committed to accepting the inheritance. But I wanted you to know that she has been there, helping to guide your path even when you didn't realize it. The key included with this letter opens a safety deposit box at Banco de Portugal, account number 1487 TM 2009. Inside that box, you'll find documents about the network's financial holdings and current operations. Study them before your council meeting. They will help you understand what you're truly accepting responsibility for. Trust Mariana, Peter. She understands the network better than anyone else of her generation, and she will be invaluable to you as you take on leadership. I believe she may become much more than just a professional colleague, if you allow it. Your grandfather, Thomas Matthews. Peter read the letter twice, his mind racing. The mysterious woman from Madrid had been watching over him the entire time, ensuring his safety while he stumbled through his discovery process. She worked for the network, came from a family with generations of involvement, and his grandfather had specifically recruited her years ago with Peter's eventual inheritance in mind. The realization that his entire Spanish journey had been more orchestrated than he had realized was both comforting and slightly unsettling. But his grandfather's final comment about Mariana potentially becoming much more than just a professional colleague suggested that the old man had seen possibilities that Peter himself hadn't yet considered. Peter was still processing the letter's revelations when he noticed a change in the cafe's atmosphere. Several regular patrons had turned their attention toward the entrance, and Señor Antonio behind the counter had straightened up with what looked like recognition and respect. A young woman had entered the cafe, and Peter's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was her. The woman from the Madrid airport, the one he had seen only briefly, but whose face had haunted his dreams throughout his Spanish journey. She was dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Without the dramatic red veil she had worn in Madrid, she looked younger and more approachable, though her intelligent eyes and confident bearing suggested someone accustomed to responsibility and authority. Mariana, it must be Mariana, scanned the cafe briefly before her gaze settled on Peter sitting at the Mateus family table. Her expression shifted from neutral observation to recognition, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she saw the open letter and photograph on the table in front of him. For several long seconds, they simply looked at each other across the crowded cafe. Peter felt an inexplicable connection, as if they had known each other for years rather than sharing only a single brief glance in an airport weeks ago. Mariana's smile widened slightly, and she gave him a small, subtle nod, acknowledgement that he had found what he was looking for, and that he now understood her role in his journey. But instead of approaching his table, Mariana turned and walked back toward the cafe's entrance. Just before leaving, she glanced back at Peter one more time, her expression conveying something that could have been promise, amusement, or perhaps a challenge. Then she was gone, disappearing into the evening crowds on Rua Garrett. Peter sat frozen for a moment, torn between the instinct to chase after her and the understanding that this brief appearance had been deliberate, another piece of the careful orchestration that had characterized his entire Portuguese experience. But curiosity and a desire he didn't fully understand won out over caution. Peter quickly gathered the letter and photograph, left money on the table for his coffee, and hurried toward the entrance. Señor Antonio called after him. "She comes here often, that one. But she is like a ghost, here one moment, gone the next. Perhaps it is better to wait for her to decide the time is right. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible moment." Peter has finally seen Mariana again, and now he knows she's been watching over him all along. But why won't she talk to him yet? What's she waiting for? Peter emerged onto Rua Garrett just in time to see Mariana turning the corner onto Rua do Carmo, heading deeper into the Barro Alto. He followed at a quick pace, trying not to run but not wanting to lose sight of her in the maze of narrow streets that characterized this neighborhood. Mariana moved with purpose through the evening crowds, clearly familiar with every turn and alley. She glanced back once or twice, confirming that Peter was following, but made no effort to slow down or make contact easier. The pursuit led Peter up steep staircases, through small squares where locals gathered at outdoor tables, and past Fado houses where the melancholy sound of Portuguese guitar drifted into the street. Lisbon at twilight was magical, but Peter was too focused on not losing Mariana to fully appreciate the atmosphere. Finally, she turned into a small square called Largo do Carmo, dominated by the haunting ruins of a Gothic church that had been destroyed in the 1755 earthquake and never rebuilt. The open-air ruins created an atmospheric space that was both beautiful and melancholy. Mariana stopped in front of the church ruins and turned to face Peter, who had just caught up to her, slightly out of breath from the chase through Lisbon's steep streets. For a moment, they stood looking at each other in the fading light, neither quite sure how to begin the conversation that had been delayed for weeks. Then Mariana spoke, her English accented but fluent. "You're faster than I expected, Peter Matthews. Most people would have given up 3 streets ago. Most people haven't been wondering about the mysterious woman from the Madrid airport for weeks," Peter replied. "Are you going to finally tell me who you are and why you've been appearing and disappearing throughout my journey?" Mariana's expression became more serious. "I'm Mariana Costa, and I work for the network your grandfather led. I've been watching over you since Madrid, making sure your discovery process proceeded safely. Why didn't you just introduce yourself from the beginning?" "Because your grandfather's instructions were very specific. You needed to discover your heritage gradually, to make your own decisions without outside pressure. If I had introduced myself too early, I would have influenced your choices in ways that he didn't want." Peter held up the photograph from the cafe table. "He knew you would be important to me." Mariana smiled softly. "Thomas was very perceptive about people and their potential connections. He thought we would work well together if you decided to accept your inheritance. And now, I've made my decision. I'm accepting the inheritance and taking leadership of the Portuguese operations." "I know. João called me after your conversation in Coimbra, which means the time for distance and mystery is over. From now on, Peter, we work together." She reached into her bag and withdrew a business card, holding it out to him. "This is my official contact information. Tomorrow, I'll take you to the Banco de Portugal to access your grandfather's safety deposit box. Then we'll begin preparing you for the council meeting." Peter took the card, noting that it identified Mariana as Operations Coordinator, Portuguese Heritage Network, with a Lisbon office address and phone number. "That's it?" Peter asked. "After weeks of mysterious appearances, you're just going to hand me a business card and tell me we'll work together?" Mariana's smile returned. "What did you expect? A dramatic revelation scene with candlelight and music? Maybe something a little more personal than a business card." "Personal will come, Peter. But first, you need to understand what you've inherited and what responsibilities you're accepting. Your grandfather trained me to prioritize the network's interests over personal feelings, and that's a lesson you'll need to learn as well." Before Peter could respond, Mariana's phone buzzed. She checked the message and her expression became more businesslike. "I have to go, but I'll meet you tomorrow at 10 a.m. at your hotel in Alfama, where something professional. We'll be meeting with bank officers and reviewing sensitive documents." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Peter one more time. "For what it's worth, your grandfather was right. I think we will work very well together." Then she was gone again, disappearing into the evening crowds with the same practiced ease she had shown all along. Peter walked slowly back through the Barro Alto toward his hotel in Alfama, his mind full of questions about Mariana and the upcoming transition to his new role. The brief conversation in Largo do Carmo had answered some questions but raised many others. When he returned to the cafe to retrieve any belongings, he might have forgotten in his rush to follow Mariana. Senor Antonio waved him over with a knowing smile. "She came back while you were chasing her," the old man said. "Left this for you." He handed Peter a small envelope with his name written on it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a brief note. "Peter, I know you have questions, and I promise to answer them all tomorrow. But tonight, just enjoy Lisboa. Walk through Alfama, listen to Fado, taste our wine. This city is part of your heritage now, and you should experience it without the weight of responsibility for one more night. The real work begins tomorrow. M." The note's informal tone was different from Mariana's businesslike manner during their conversation, suggesting that perhaps there was a more personal side to her that she kept carefully controlled while on network business. Peter decided to take her advice. He spent the evening wandering through Alfama's narrow streets, eventually finding a small fado house where he sat in the candlelit darkness, listening to a singer pour her soul into songs of longing and fate. The Portuguese word saudade, an untranslatable emotion combining nostalgia, longing, and melancholy, seemed to define not just the music but Peter's entire emotional state. He was simultaneously excited about the future and nostalgic for the simple life he had left behind in Chicago. He felt drawn to Mariana but wary of mixing professional relationships with personal feelings. He was confident about his ability to lead the network but uncertain about the moral complexities he would face. As the fado singer's voice filled the small space with emotion, Peter thought about his grandfather's words, "Be brave, be honest, and trust your instincts." The old man had guided him to this moment through carefully placed letters and orchestrated encounters. But from here on, Peter would have to find his own way. Back in his hotel room late that night, Peter spread out all the documents and letters he had collected throughout his journey. The Madrid airport envelope, the wooden box from Barcelona, the documents from Toledo and Granada, the monastery papers from Zaragoza, the vineyard records from La Rioja, his grandfather's letters from Coimbra and Lisbon. Together they told the story of a network that had operated for 5 centuries, protecting people and preserving knowledge. But they also told the story of Peter's own transformation. He had arrived in Madrid as a disillusioned former information broker trying to escape his past, and he was preparing to enter a council meeting as the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back to the age of exploration. Peter's phone buzzed with a text message from João. "Everything is prepared for the council meeting next week. The members are eager to meet you formally. Mariana will help you prepare. Trust her completely. She understands the Portuguese operations better than anyone except your grandfather did." Another message came through, this one from an unknown number but clearly from Mariana. "Sleep well, Peter. Tomorrow we begin your real education about what it means to lead the network. It won't be easy, but I think you're ready. See you at 10 a.m. Peter set his phone aside and walked to his window, looking out over the red roofs of Alfama toward the river. Somewhere out there, Klaus was planning how to respond to Peter's reformist agenda. Somewhere in the city, Mariana was preparing documents and briefings for tomorrow's sessions. And somewhere in the broader network, people were watching to see if the young American could successfully take on the responsibilities his grandfather had prepared him for. But for tonight, Peter allowed himself to simply be present in this moment, standing at a window in Lisbon, on the eve of accepting a 500-year-old legacy, with mysteries still unsolved and a future that promised to be anything but ordinary. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper through the warm Lisbon night, "Be brave, be honest, and trust your instincts." Tomorrow, Peter would begin to apply those principles as the leader of the Portuguese operations. But tonight, he was simply Peter Matthews, a young man far from Chicago, about to begin the greatest adventure of his life. Thank you for staying with us through this magical evening in Lisbon. Peter has finally met Mariana properly and learned that she's been protecting him throughout his entire journey. The mysterious guardian from Madrid is real. She's beautiful, she's brilliant, and she'll be working closely with Peter as he takes on his new responsibilities. But Mariana made it clear that personal feelings must wait while professional duties take priority, a boundary that suggests she's as attracted to Peter as he is to her, even if she's better at controlling those feelings. The note she left at the cafe hinted at a warmer, more personal side beneath her professional exterior. Peter now has one night to process everything before beginning his intensive preparation for the council meeting. Tomorrow, Mariana will show him the full scope of what he's inherited, including financial records and operational details that will reveal the network's true scale and complexity. The romantic tension between Peter and Mariana is building beautifully, but both understand that earning the network's trust and proving Peter's leadership capabilities must come first. Will they be able to maintain professional boundaries while working so closely together? And what will happen when the pressures of leadership test their growing connection? Don't miss the next episodes as Peter's story continues with new challenges, deeper mysteries, and the developing romance that his grandfather predicted years ago. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. The best is yet to come. The morning after his encounter with Mariana in Lisbon, Peter woke early with a sense of purpose. The council meeting was scheduled for the following week in Porto, but his grandfather's letter from a Brasileira had contained one more cryptic reference that Peter had been puzzling over. The bravest guardian of our maritime routes lives where the waves touch the sky. Seek him before you face the council. After some research, Peter had identified the location as Nazaré, a fishing village about 120 kilometers north of Lisbon that had become world famous for producing some of the largest waves ever surfed. The town's unique underwater canyon created oceanic conditions that could generate waves over 30 meters high, drawing big wave surfers from around the world and creating a spectacle that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Peter rented a small car and set out from Lisbon in the early morning, driving north along the coast road that offered spectacular views of the Atlantic Ocean. The journey gave him time to think about everything that had happened since his arrival in Spain, and to prepare mentally for the responsibilities he was about to accept. The Portuguese coastline was dramatic and beautiful, with golden beaches, rocky cliffs, and small fishing villages that looked much as they must have for centuries. Peter found himself falling in love with this country that had given birth to his family's legacy, understanding why his ancestors had felt such a deep connection to this land and its people. As he drove, Peter thought about Mariana and the brief but intense connection they had shared in Lisbon. Her professional distance made sense given the circumstances, but he couldn't help wondering what might develop between them once the immediate pressures of the council meeting had passed. His grandfather's letter had suggested that Mariana might become much more than a professional colleague, and Peter found himself hoping the old man's intuition would prove correct. But first, there was work to be done. If his grandfather had specifically directed him to Nazaré before the council meeting, then whatever waited there must be important to his preparation for leadership. Nazaré announced itself from a distance with the distinctive sight of the Forte de São Miguel perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The fortress, built in the 16th century to protect the coast from pirates, now served as a viewing platform where tourists and locals gathered to watch the massive waves that made Nazaré famous. Peter arrived in the town around mid-morning and was immediately struck by how different it felt from the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Lisbon or Porto. This was a working fishing village that happened to have become famous, but it retained its authentic character despite the tourist attention. The lower town, along the beach, was filled with colorful boats pulled up on the sand and fishermen mending nets with the practiced efficiency of people whose families had been doing the same work for generations. Women in traditional dress, 7 skirts layered for warmth and modesty, sold fresh fish at market stalls, maintaining customs that stretched back centuries. Peter parked his car and made his way to the Forte de São Miguel, taking the funicular railway that climbed the cliff face to reach the fortress. From the viewing platform, he could see the full scope of the ocean's power, waves rolling in from the Atlantic, building in size as they approached the shore, then crashing against the rocks with explosive force that sent spray 50 meters into the air. Even on a relatively calm day, the waves were impressive. Peter tried to imagine what they must look like during the winter storms that created the legendary giant waves, and he felt a mixture of awe and fear at the ocean's raw power. "Magnificent, isn't it?" said a voice beside him in accented English. Peter turned to find an elderly man, weather-beaten and sturdy, with the look of someone who had spent a lifetime at sea. He wore a traditional fisherman's sweater and a wool cap, and his hands showed the scars and calluses of decades of physical work. "It's incredible," Peter replied. "I've never seen waves like this." "These are nothing," the old man said with a slight smile. "In winter, they are 3 times this size. Walls of water that can destroy ships and kill men who aren't careful. Or even men who are careful, if the sea decides it's their time." "You're a fisherman?" "I was for many years. Now I'm too old for the boats, so I come here to remember." The old man studied Peter's face carefully. "You have the look of someone searching for something specific. Perhaps someone specific." Peter decided to take a chance. "I'm looking for Manuel Silva. I was told he might be found near the fortress." The old man's expression shifted to one of cautious interest. I am Manuel Silva, and you, I think, must be Thomas Matthew's grandson. You have his eyes. Manuel invited Peter to his home, a modest house on the hillside above the town with a terrace that offered stunning views of the ocean. The interior was simple but comfortable, filled with maritime artifacts, photographs of boats and fishing crews, and religious icons that spoke to the deep faith common among people whose lives depended on the sea's mercy. Your grandfather was a good man, Manuel said as he prepared strong coffee in his small kitchen. He came here many times over the years, always asking about the routes, always concerned that we were keeping people safe. Routes? Peter asked, though he suspected what Manuel meant. The secret maritime routes that your family's network has used for centuries to move people and valuable cargo away from dangers. Routes that avoid official ports and customs inspections, that use the ocean's natural features to hide movement from those who might want to stop it. Manuel brought the coffee to the terrace, and they sat looking out at the vast Atlantic that had shaped so much of Portuguese history and identity. I worked for your family's network for 40 years, Manuel continued. My father worked for them before me, and his father before him. The Silva family has been helping the Mateus family since the 1500s, when we helped your ancestors move manuscripts and artifacts away from the Inquisition's reach. Peter felt the familiar weight of discovering yet another layer of his family's extensive network. What kind of work did you do for them? Manuel's expression became more serious. I moved people who needed to disappear. Families fleeing from situations where their lives were in danger. Sometimes I moved documents or artifacts that couldn't be trusted to normal shipping routes. And sometimes I moved money, gold, jewelry, things that could be converted to cash to help fund the network's operations. Wasn't that dangerous? Very dangerous. The ocean itself is always dangerous, but when you're carrying illegal cargo and trying to avoid patrol boats and customs inspections, it becomes even more so. Manuel paused, his eyes distant with memory. I've been in storms that should have killed me. I've outrun patrol boats in the dark. I've landed on beaches in the middle of the night to pick up families who had minutes to escape before their enemies arrived. Why did you do it? Why take such risks? Manuel looked at Peter with an expression that combined pride and something like sadness. Because it was the right thing to do. Because the people I helped had nowhere else to turn. Because your grandfather convinced me that what we were doing was important enough to risk my life for. What do you think about the courage of people like Manuel, who risked everything to help others without seeking recognition or reward? These are the real heroes of Peter's family legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. Manuel stood and went inside, returning with a leather portfolio that looked very old and well used. Inside were maritime charts and maps that showed the Portuguese coast and the Atlantic beyond, but with notations and markings that wouldn't appear on any official navigation documents. These are the routes, Manuel explained, spreading several charts on the terrace table. Your ancestors spent centuries mapping currents, identifying hidden coves, learning the timing of patrols, and discovering ways to move along the coast without being detected. Peter studied the charts with growing fascination. They showed intricate details about tides, currents, seasonal weather patterns, and geographical features that could be used to hide or facilitate movement. Some routes hugged the coast, using small harbors and beaches that were too shallow or rocky for patrol boats. Others struck out into the Atlantic, using ocean currents and prevailing winds to carry vessels quickly away from European waters. Are these routes still used? Peter asked. Some of them, yes. The network still needs to move people and things discreetly, though the reasons and methods have changed over the centuries. But Peter, you need to understand something important. Manuel's expression became grave. Not everyone in your family's network wants to use these routes for humanitarian purposes. There are people who see them as opportunities for profit smuggling goods, avoiding taxes, moving money for clients who pay well regardless of whether their causes are just. You're talking about Klaus and his branch of the network. I don't know all the names or all the politics, Manuel replied. But your grandfather warned me that there were elements within the network who were forgetting its original mission. People who cared more about accumulating wealth than about helping those in need. Manuel rolled up the charts and handed them to Peter. "These belong to you now, as the inheritor of your family's leadership. But you need to decide how they'll be used, whether they'll continue serving humanitarian purposes, or whether they'll become just another tool for those who value profit over people." As the afternoon progressed, Manuel shared stories from his 4 decades of service to the network. Each tale revealed the human cost and the moral complexity of the work he had done. He told Peter about a family of 5 he had picked up from a beach south of Lisbon in the middle of a storm, risking his boat and his life to help them escape from people who wanted to harm them. The waves had been so large that several times he thought they would capsize, but he had gotten the family safely to a port in northern Spain where network contacts helped them start new lives. He described transporting artwork and manuscripts that had been threatened by various conflicts, wrapping them in waterproof materials and hiding them in secret compartments in his boat's hull. Some of these items had been worth millions, but Manuel had never been tempted to steal or sell them. His commitment was to the network's mission, not to personal gain. But Manuel also spoke honestly about the moral gray areas he had navigated. He had sometimes moved cargo without knowing exactly what it contained or who it was ultimately meant for. He had lied to officials, falsified documents, and broken numerous laws in pursuit of what he believed was a higher purpose. "I'm not a saint," Manuel said plainly. "I've done things that technically make me a criminal, but I've also helped save lives and preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been lost." "You'll face similar choices, Peter. Leading the network means accepting that sometimes doing the right thing requires doing things that aren't strictly legal." Peter appreciated the old fisherman's honesty. Unlike Klaus, who had emphasized the network's noble mission while downplaying its moral complexity, or João, who had focused on the intellectual and historical aspects, Manuel spoke from the perspective of someone who had actually done the difficult work. "How did you maintain your moral compass?" Peter asked. "How did you know you were making the right choices?" Manuel thought for a long moment before answering. "I always asked myself, who does this help, and who does it hurt? If the answer was that it helped people who had no other options and hurt no one except perhaps some bureaucrats who cared more about rules than about human welfare, then I did it. If the answer was less clear, I consulted with your grandfather, and I trusted his judgment. What if you disagreed with his judgment? Then I didn't do it. Your grandfather understood that the network's strength came from people who chose to participate because they believed in the mission, not from people who followed orders blindly. He never forced me to do anything that violated my conscience." As evening approached, Manuel brought out one more item, a beautiful antique sextant in a polished wooden case. The navigation instrument was clearly very old and had been lovingly maintained, its brass fittings gleaming despite their age. "Your grandfather left this with me 15 years ago," Manuel explained. "He said that when his grandson came to Nazaré seeking knowledge about the maritime routes, I should give him this sextant along with the charts." Peter opened the case carefully and examined the instrument. On the base was an engraving, "Mateus Family, Never Lose Your Way, 1487. A sextant helps sailors determine their position by measuring the angle between celestial objects and the horizon," Manuel explained. In the age before GPS and modern navigation, it was essential for finding your way across the ocean when there were no landmarks to guide you. "Why did my grandfather want me to have this?" He said it was a reminder that navigating the network's complex moral waters would be like navigating the ocean. You need to constantly check your position, make sure you're heading in the right direction, and adjust your course when necessary. He said that the sextant was a symbol of maintaining your moral bearing, even when there are no easy reference points to guide you. Peter held the ancient instrument, feeling the weight of both the physical object and its metaphorical significance. His grandfather's gift was perfect, a practical tool from the maritime heritage that had shaped his family's history, transformed into a symbol for ethical leadership. "There's something else," Manuel said, reaching into the sextant's case and pulling out a small note written in his grandfather's handwriting. "Peter, if you're reading this in Manuel's home, then you've learned about the maritime routes that have served our network for centuries. These routes represent both opportunity and temptation. They can be used to help people escape from danger, or they can be used to avoid legitimate oversight and accountability. Your challenge will be to preserve the former purpose while preventing the latter abuse. Use this sextant to remind yourself to constantly check your moral position. The ocean has no mercy for those who lose their way. Neither does history. Your grandfather. Thank you for staying with us through these incredible stories of courage. Manuel's tales show that the network's humanitarian work was done by real people taking real risks, not abstract historical figures. The sextant represents Peter's responsibility to maintain his moral compass. Peter spent another hour with Manuel, asking questions about the specific routes, the network's maritime operations, and the practical challenges of moving people and cargo discreetly. The old fisherman's knowledge was encyclopedic, accumulated through decades of direct experience rather than academic study. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Manuel walked Peter back to his car. "One more thing," the fisherman said as they prepared to part. "Your grandfather told me that you would face pressure to use the network's resources for purposes that don't align with its humanitarian mission. He said that some people would try to convince you that profit and humanitarian work could coexist peacefully, but that history shows they eventually come into conflict." "Klaus," Peter said, "I don't know the man, but I know the type. People who start by justifying compromises for practical reasons and end by losing sight of why the network exists in the first place." Manuel gripped Peter's shoulder with his weathered hand. "Stay true to the mission, Peter. The network has survived for 5 centuries because people like your grandfather understood that some things are more important than money or power." As Peter drove back toward Lisbon in the gathering darkness, he felt a profound respect for Manuel Silva and the countless other people like him who had served the network without recognition or reward. These were the true guardians of his family's legacy, not the sophisticated coordinators in expensive offices, but the men and women who had risked their lives because they believed in helping others. The drive back to Lisbon gave Peter several hours to process everything he had learned in Nazaré. The maritime charts and the antique sextant sat in the passenger seat, physical reminders of the new knowledge he had acquired and the new responsibilities he was accepting. Peter stopped several times at Miraduros along the coast, standing in the darkness and listening to the waves crash against the shore. The ocean that had shaped Portugal's history and his family's legacy felt both beautiful and dangerous, a perfect metaphor for the network he was about to lead. At one particularly dramatic viewpoint, Peter took out the sextant and tried to imagine his ancestors using similar instruments to navigate their way across unknown oceans, trusting in their skill and their tools to guide them safely to distant shores. The courage required for those early voyages must have been extraordinary, setting out across a vast ocean with limited knowledge and primitive technology, driven by curiosity and ambition and perhaps a touch of desperation. The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on him. Peter was about to navigate into unknown territory himself, taking leadership of an organization he had only begun to understand, facing opposition from elements within the network who didn't share his vision, and trying to maintain a humanitarian focus in a world that increasingly valued profit over people. But Manuel's stories had given him confidence. The old fisherman had faced storms that should have killed him, had outrun patrol boats in the dark, had made split-second decisions that determined whether families lived or died. If Manuel could maintain his moral compass through 40 years of such challenges, then Peter could at least try to do the same. As he approached the outskirts of Lisbon, Peter's phone buzzed with a text message from João. "The council meeting is confirmed for next week in Porto. All members will attend. This is when you formally accept your inheritance and present your vision for the network's future. Are you ready?" Peter thought about his grandfather's letters, about Klaus's manipulation in Spain, about the humanitarian work documented in wine barrels in La Rioja, about João's steady guidance in Porto and Coimbra, about Mariana's mysterious protection throughout his journey, and about Manuel's courage in Nazaré. He typed back, "I'm ready. See you in Porto." Another message came through, this one from Mariana. "I heard you visited Nazaré. Manuel is a good man, one of the best the network has ever had. Whatever he told you, believe it. See you at the council meeting." Peter smiled at the message, appreciating that Mariana seemed to understand the significance of his visit to the old fisherman without needing detailed explanations. Perhaps that was part of what his grandfather had seen in her, an intuitive understanding of the network's values and the people who embodied them. As Peter navigated through Lisbon's evening traffic back to his hotel in Alfama, he felt more prepared for the challenges ahead than at any point since arriving in Europe. He had discovered his family's history, understood the network's complexity, and met people who exemplified the courage and integrity that had sustained the organization for 5 centuries. The council meeting would be his chance to demonstrate that he was worthy of the legacy he was inheriting, that he understood both its opportunities and its dangers, and that he was committed to preserving its humanitarian mission even when that commitment required difficult choices. Manuel's sextant sat beside him in the car, a constant reminder to check his moral position and maintain his course even when navigating through storms. The maritime charts contained knowledge that would be crucial for the network's future operations. And the stories of courage he had heard would inspire him when he faced opposition from those who valued profit over people. Peter Matthews had traveled far from the disillusioned information broker who had fled Chicago seeking escape from his past. He had become Peter Mateus, ready to accept a 500-year-old legacy and to shape it for the challenges of the 21st century. The waves of Nazaré had taught him that the ocean shows no mercy to those who lose their way. The council meeting in Porto would show whether he had learned that lesson well enough to lead. Thank you for staying with us through this inspiring journey to Nazaré. Manuel Silva's stories of courage showed Peter what true commitment to the network's humanitarian mission looks like. Not speeches and philosophy, but real people taking real risks to help others. The maritime charts and the ancestral sextant are more than just historical artifacts. They're tools and symbols that Peter will need as he takes on leadership. The routes can help people escape danger, but they can also be misused for profit. Peter's challenge will be to ensure the former while preventing the latter. Manuel's final warning about people who start with compromises and end by losing sight of the mission is clearly aimed at Klaus and those who share his priorities. The battle for the network's soul will come to a head at the council meeting, and Peter now has the knowledge and the moral clarity to fight for what his grandfather believed in. What do you think Peter will do with the maritime routes? Will he be able to maintain the humanitarian focus that Manuel and his grandfather valued? And how will the council members react to Peter's reformist vision? Don't miss the next episodes as Peter's journey continues with the crucial council meeting where everything will be decided. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. The most important confrontation is just ahead. The drive from Lisbon to Porto should have been straightforward, a 3-hour journey north along Portugal's main highway. But Peter found himself taking a detour that added several hours to his trip, drawn by a cryptic notation on one of Manuel's maritime charts that had puzzled him since leaving Nazaré. Among the coastal routes and ocean currents, Manuel had marked a single inland location, Evora, the medieval city in the heart of the Alentejo region. Beside the marking was a simple note in Portuguese, "Where bones remember what hearts forget." Peter had researched Evora during his drive and learned that it was one of Portugal's most historically significant cities, a UNESCO World Heritage Site with Roman ruins, medieval walls, and a famous chapel decorated entirely with human bones. But he couldn't understand why Manuel would have marked it on maritime charts, or what connection it might have to his family's network. As he drove inland from the coast, the landscape changed dramatically. The green hills and ocean views gave way to the vast plains of the Alentejo, golden with wheat fields and dotted with cork oak trees that had been harvested for centuries. The heat was intense. The Alentejo was known as Portugal's hottest region, and even in autumn the sun beat down mercilessly. Evora announced itself from a distance, a cluster of white buildings surrounded by medieval walls, crowned by the towers of its cathedral and the distinctive Roman temple that had stood in the city center for 2,000 years. As Peter approached the historic center, he felt as though he was driving backward through time, leaving the 21st century behind and entering an era where the past still dominated the present. He parked outside the medieval walls and walked into the old city through one of the ancient gates. The narrow streets were paved with irregular stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. Whitewashed houses with yellow trim created a distinctive Alentejo aesthetic that was both simple and elegant. The heat radiated from the stones, creating waves of shimmering air that made the ancient buildings seem to waver like mirages. Peter made his way to the center of Evora, passing the Roman temple, the Templo de Diana, with its elegant columns that had somehow survived when so many other Roman structures had crumbled to dust. The juxtaposition of eras was remarkable. Roman ruins next to medieval churches, Baroque palaces adjacent to Moorish-influenced houses, all coexisting in a city that seemed to have absorbed every layer of Portuguese history. But Peter's destination was the Capela dos Ossos, the Chapel of Bones, located beside the Church of St. Francis. He had read about this macabre monument during his drive, learning that it had been constructed in the 16th century by Franciscan monks who had decorated its interior with the bones and skulls of approximately 5,000 people, creating a meditation on mortality and the transient nature of earthly existence. The entrance to the chapel was marked by an inscription that sent a chill through Peter despite the oppressive heat. Nos ossos que aquí estamos, pelos vasos esperamos. We bones that are here, for yours we wait. Peter paid the small entrance fee and stepped into the chapel. Nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him. Every surface of the 3 small rooms was covered with human bones. Skulls formed decorative patterns along the walls. Femurs and tibias were arranged in geometric designs. Complete skeletons hung from the ceiling. The effect was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, an artistic achievement that was also a profound memento mori, reminding visitors that death comes for everyone, that the bones on the walls had once been people with hopes and dreams and fears just like those who now stood looking at them. Peter found himself deeply moved by the chapel in ways he hadn't expected. The bones weren't presented as grotesque or frightening, but rather as a meditation on the equality of death, that regardless of wealth, status, or achievement in life, all human beings eventually become nothing more than bones and dust. As he stood in the chapel's dim light, surrounded by the remains of thousands of people who had lived and died centuries ago, Peter thought about his own legacy and the choices he was about to make. Would his actions be remembered? Would they matter in the long perspective of history? Or would he, like these anonymous bones, eventually be forgotten except as part of a larger pattern? It makes you think, doesn't it? Said a voice behind him in accented English. Peter turned to find an elderly monk in traditional brown Franciscan robes, his weathered face showing the serenity of someone who had spent decades contemplating mortality. It does, Peter agreed. I've never seen anything quite like it. Most people haven't, the monk replied. But that's the point. The brothers who built this chapel wanted to create something that would force people to confront truths they normally avoid. That life is temporary, that death is certain, and that how we live matters more than how long we live. The monk studied Peter's face with interest. You have the look of someone carrying heavy questions. Perhaps the chapel has brought them to the surface. Peter decided to take a chance. I'm researching my family's history. The name is Mateus, and I was told there might be records in Evora related to my ancestors. The monk's expression shifted subtly. Mateus. Yes, that name appears in our archives. Come with me. The monk, who introduced himself as Brother Miguel, led Peter through a door behind the main chapel into a warren of small rooms and passages that had been built into the thick medieval walls. They climbed narrow stone stairs to an upper floor where the monastery's archives were housed, a collection of documents, ledgers, and manuscripts that chronicled centuries of Franciscan activity in Evora. The Mateus family has connections to Evora going back to the early 16th century, Brother Miguel explained as he unlocked a heavy wooden cabinet. They were benefactors of the monastery, but their relationship with the brothers was complicated. Complicated how? Brother Miguel withdrew several leather-bound volumes and spread them on an old wooden table. The Franciscans have always struggled with a tension between our ideals and the practical realities of operating in the world. We take vows of poverty, but we need resources to help the poor. We preach peace, but sometimes we must work with violent powers to protect the innocent. The Mateus family often put us in positions where we had to choose between pure principles and practical necessity. Peter opened one of the volumes and found himself looking at financial records from the 1530s, written in faded ink that was still legible after nearly 500 years. The entries documented payments made by the Mateus family to the monastery, but the purposes were described in cryptic terms: for the protection of certain souls, for the selective preservation of those most valuable, for the difficult choice between many needs and limited means. What do these entries mean? Peter asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Brother Miguel sat heavily in an old chair, his expression troubled. Your ancestors came to the monastery when they needed to make choices that troubled their consciences. They had resources to help people escape from persecution or danger, but they couldn't help everyone. So they asked the brothers to help them decide who should be saved and who should be left to their fate. What do you think about discovering that your family made impossible choices about who deserved to be saved? These are the kinds of moral dilemmas leaders face throughout history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Peter felt his stomach tighten as Brother Miguel continued explaining. The documents revealed a side of the Mateus family network that none of his other discoveries had shown: the cold calculations and pragmatic choices that had accompanied their humanitarian work. In 1536, Brother Miguel said, pointing to a specific entry, your ancestors had resources to move 20 people to safety, but they had over 100 families asking for help. They came to the monastery and asked the brothers to help them evaluate which families would be most valuable to save, which had skills or knowledge or connections that would justify the expense and risk. So they made a list, ranked people by their usefulness. Yes, and the brothers helped them do it because if they didn't, no one would be saved at all. But it troubled the monks deeply. Some of the entries include prayers for forgiveness, acknowledgments that they were playing God by deciding who would live and who would die. Peter turned the pages, finding more and more evidence of this same pattern. His ancestors hadn't just been noble preservationists saving culture and protecting the innocent. They had been pragmatic operators making calculated decisions about human value, choosing who deserved their limited resources based on strategic considerations rather than pure need. One entry from 1542 was particularly stark. The Mateus family has chosen to save the scholar and his family rather than the larger group of farmers, arguing that the scholar's knowledge is irreplaceable while the farmers, though more numerous and perhaps more desperate, do not offer the same long-term value to the network's mission. This is horrible, Peter said quietly. Is it? Brother Miguel challenged gently. If you have resources to save 20 people and 100 people need saving, how do you choose? Random selection? First come, first served? Or do you make difficult calculations about who can contribute most to the common good if they survive? But these were people's lives. Yes, they were. And your ancestors took the responsibility of choosing very seriously. The records show that they agonized over these decisions, that they sought spiritual guidance, that they tried to balance practical necessity with moral principle. But in the end, they chose. Because not choosing helping no one because you can't help everyone is also a choice. Brother Miguel brought out additional documents, letters, personal journals, and confessional records that painted a more complete picture of how the Mateus family network had actually operated during its early centuries. Peter learned that his ancestors had developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating who to help. They prioritized people with valuable skills: scholars, artisans, physicians. They favored families over individuals, reasoning that saving a family unit created more social stability than saving isolated people. They gave preference to those who could pay at least partial costs for their rescue, using those payments to subsidize help for others who had no resources. But they also made mistakes. Some people they saved turned out to be less worthy than anticipated criminals who used their rescue to escape justice, opportunists who took advantage of the network's generosity. And some people they chose not to help turned out to have been exactly the kind of individuals who would have contributed greatly to society if given the chance. Your ancestors kept meticulous records of their failures as well as their successes, Brother Miguel explained. They wanted future generations of the family to learn from their mistakes. That's why these documents are here. They asked the monastery to preserve them as a kind of moral education for their descendants. One letter, written by Peter's ancestor João Mateus in 1547, was particularly moving. I have today received news that the family we chose not to help last year has perished, including 3 children under the age of 10. We made our decision based on practical considerations. They had no valuable skills, no resources to contribute, no connections that would help our network. But they were human beings and they deserved to live, and we could have saved them if we had chosen differently. I pray that God will forgive us for the calculations we make with human lives, and I pray that my descendants will be wiser and more compassionate than I have been." Peter felt tears in his eyes as he read the letter. His ancestors' anguish was palpable across nearly 5 centuries. A reminder that these weren't abstract historical decisions but real choices made by real people who understood the moral weight of what they were doing. "Did it get easier over time?" Peter asked. "Did later generations become more comfortable with making these choices?" Brother Miguel shook his head. "According to the records, no. Each generation seemed to struggle with the same moral tensions. Some tried to develop more systematic criteria to make the choices less subjective. Others tried to expand their resources so they could help more people. But the fundamental problem never went away. Needs always exceeded resources, and someone had to decide who would be helped and who wouldn't. What about my grandfather? Are there records of his decisions?" "Some. Your grandfather visited Evora several times, and he too struggled with the same questions. The 20th century brought new types of emergencies and new scale to the problems: wars, political upheavals, mass migrations. Your grandfather's generation had to make choices about thousands of people rather than dozens. But the moral calculus remained the same." Brother Miguel showed Peter one final document, a thick ledger that had been maintained continuously since the network's founding. It was titled simply The Ledger of Souls, and contained the names of every person the Mateus family network had helped over the centuries, along with brief descriptions of what had happened to them afterward. Peter turned the pages carefully, reading entry after entry. Some were triumphant stories, people who had been saved and had gone on to make significant contributions to art, science, or society. Others were more mundane families who had simply survived and lived quiet lives, which was its own form of success. And some were tragic people who had been saved but had suffered afterward, or had failed to make good use of the second chance they'd been given. But what struck Peter most forcefully was a second column in the ledger, a list of people who had been denied help, maintained with the same meticulous care as the list of those who had been saved. "Why keep a record of the people they didn't help?" Peter asked. "Because your ancestors believed they owed those people at least the dignity of being remembered," Brother Miguel replied. "They couldn't save them, but they could acknowledge that they had existed, that they had asked for help, and that the choice to not help them was a deliberate decision rather than simple negligence." Peter found entries that listed families who had been turned away with explanations: resources insufficient, strategic value unclear, risk too great, more urgent cases take priority. Each entry was a person or family whose lives had ended or been destroyed because his ancestors had decided their resources were better spent elsewhere. Near the back of the ledger, Peter found entries from his grandfather's time as coordinator. The entries were in English rather than Portuguese, and the handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's. One entry from 1987 read, "Denied assistance to Rodriguez family, 5 members, 3 children. Resources committed to larger group evacuation in different region. Rodriguez family subsequently lost 2 children. This decision will haunt me, but I believe the larger group evacuation saved more lives overall. God forgive me for the mathematics of mercy." Peter closed the ledger, unable to read more. His grandfather, the gentleman who had taught him to play chess and had taken him to baseball games, had been making these impossible choices, carrying the weight of these decisions, living with the knowledge that his pragmatic calculations had consequences measured in human lives. "Why are you showing me this?" Peter asked Brother Miguel. "Why reveal the darkest parts of my family's history?" "Because you're about to take on leadership of the network," the monk replied simply. "And if you're going to lead, you need to understand that the work isn't simple or pure. You'll have to make the same kinds of choices your ancestors made. You'll have to decide who deserves help and who doesn't, who gets saved and who doesn't. And you'll have to live with the consequences of those decisions. What if I decide I don't want that responsibility? What if I walk away? Then the work stops and all the people who might have been helped won't be. That's also a choice, also a decision with consequences. There's no way to avoid moral responsibility in this situation. Peter, you can only decide whether to accept it consciously and try to do the best you can, or to refuse it and let others make the decisions instead. Peter spent another hour in the monastery archives, reading through documents and wrestling with the implications of what he had learned. The heroic narrative he had been constructing about his family's network, noble preservationists saving innocent people from persecution, had been complicated by the reality that those same ancestors had made cold calculations about human worth, had chosen who lived and died based on strategic value rather than pure need. But he also recognized that Brother Miguel was right. Not making those choices would have meant helping no one at all. His ancestors had chosen to do imperfect good rather than to maintain perfect moral purity while doing nothing. They had wrestled with their consciences, had sought spiritual guidance, had kept meticulous records of their failures as well as their successes. They had tried to balance humanitarian ideals with practical necessity, and they had lived with the moral weight of their decisions. As Peter prepared to leave Evora, Brother Miguel walked him back through the Capella dos Ossos one final time. The brothers who built this chapel understood something important, the monk said as they stood surrounded by bones. That death comes for everyone, that our time is limited, and that the only question that matters is how we use the time we have. Your ancestors tried to use their resources to help as many people as they could. They made mistakes, they made difficult choices, and they lived with consequences. But they tried. Peter looked at the inscription above the chapel entrance. We bones that are here, for yours we wait. When my bones are added to history's collection, Peter said quietly, I want them to represent someone who tried to do the right thing, even when the right thing wasn't clear. Then you're ready for the council meeting, Brother Miguel replied. Because that's all anyone can really do, try their best with imperfect information, accept the weight of their choices, and hope that the good they do outweighs the harm. As Peter drove north toward Porto, the images from the Capella dos Ossos stayed with him. All those bones that had once been people with their own struggles and choices and moral dilemmas. His family's network had saved thousands of people over 5 centuries, but it had also made difficult choices that had consequences for those who weren't saved. The maritime charts and the antique sextant from Manuel took on new meaning. The sextant wasn't just a tool for finding your geographic position. It was a reminder to constantly check your moral position, to make sure you were still heading in the right direction even when every choice involved compromise and complexity. Peter's phone buzzed with a message from João. The council meets tomorrow at 2 p.m. in Porto. All members confirmed. This is when you either accept your inheritance or walk away. Are you still coming? Peter pulled over at a rest stop and looked out at the Portuguese countryside, golden with late afternoon light. He thought about his grandfather's letter from Coimbra, about Manuel's courage in Nazaré, about the love letters in La Rioja, about Klaus's manipulation, about Mariana's mysterious protection, and about the bones in Evora that remembered what hearts forget. He typed back, I'm coming, and I know what I need to say. The council meeting would force him to make his choice. Accept leadership of a network that involved moral complexity and difficult decisions, or walk away from a legacy that included both heroism and pragmatic calculation. But Evora had taught him that there were no perfect choices, only human ones. The question wasn't whether he would make mistakes or face impossible dilemmas. The question was whether he would accept responsibility for trying to do good in a world that rarely offered clear moral paths. As Peter continued driving north toward Porto and the meeting that would determine his future, he felt something he hadn't expected. A sense of peace. Not because the choices ahead were easy, but because he finally understood what accepting his inheritance really meant, not inheriting wealth or status or power, but inheriting the responsibility to make difficult choices and to live with their consequences, just as his ancestors had done for 500 years. The bones of Evora would wait for his bones eventually, as they waited for everyone's. But until then, Peter would try to use his time and resources to help as many people as he could, acknowledging that he couldn't help everyone, accepting that his choices would have consequences, and hoping that his descendants would learn from both his successes and his failures, just as he had learned from those who came before him. Thank you for staying with us through this profound and challenging episode. Evora's Chapel of Bones revealed the darkest truths about Peter's inheritance, that heroism and difficult moral choices have always coexisted in the network, that his ancestors made pragmatic decisions about who deserved to be saved, and that leadership means accepting responsibility for impossible choices. Peter discovered that his grandfather and all the Matthias leaders before him struggled with the same moral dilemmas: how to help as many people as possible when resources are limited, how to choose between competing needs, and how to live with the consequences of those choices. The Ledger of Souls showed both those who were saved and those who weren't, acknowledging that every choice to help someone meant choosing not to help someone else. But Evora also taught Peter something important: that trying to do imperfect good is better than maintaining perfect moral purity while doing nothing. His ancestors weren't heroes in a simple story. They were human beings making difficult choices in complicated situations, trying their best with imperfect information, and accepting the weight of their decisions. Peter now drives toward Porto with new understanding of what his inheritance really means. Tomorrow's council meeting will force him to choose: accept leadership with all its moral complexity, or walk away from responsibility that someone else will have to carry. But after Evora, Peter understands that leadership isn't about having all the answers or making perfect choices. It's about accepting responsibility and trying your best, even when every option involves compromise. What do you think Peter will decide at the council meeting? Will he accept leadership knowing the moral weight it carries? Or will the revelations from Evora convince him to walk away? Don't miss the next episode where everything comes to a head at the crucial council meeting in Porto. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. The most important decision of Peter's life is just ahead.